At Liberty State University, the crisp autumn air carried more than just falling leaves. It carried the weight of a nation divided. The 2024 election season had transformed the prestigious campus into a microcosm of America's political battleground, where every classroom discussion could spark intense debate. Among the towering brick buildings and tree-lined pathways, Marcus Johnson stood out not just for his academic excellence, but for his unique position as one of the few conservative black students in the political science graduate program. At 22, his tall frame and thoughtful demeanor commanded respect, even as his political views often raised eyebrows. Another protest? Marcus muttered to himself, watching a group of students gathering near the political science building, their signs displaying various liberal slogans. He adjusted his messenger bag, filled with carefully researched papers and academic journals, and continued his walk to class. Inside the halls of the political science department, the atmosphere was electric. Campaign posters and debate announcements covered bulletin boards, while heated discussions spilled out of every classroom. Marcus navigated these waters with the grace of someone who had learned to be both visible and invisible. Visible for his academic achievements, yet often feeling invisible when his political views didn't align with the expected narrative. "Hey, Marcus," called out Jennifer Chin, one of his few classmates who didn't shy away from friendly debate. "Ready for Dr. Whitfield's class? I heard she's announcing the final paper topic today." Marcus nodded, a slight smile playing at his lips. "As ready as I'll ever be, though I'm sure whatever topic she chooses will be interesting." His voice carried a hint of knowing resignation. Dr. Sarah Whitfield's Advanced Political Theory seminar was notorious for its challenging assignments and even more challenging discussions. As Marcus and Jennifer entered the classroom, they found the distinguished professor already there, her silver hair perfectly styled and her posture radiating authority. Her office walls, visible through the open door across the hall, were lined with books on progressive politics and social justice theory. The classroom filled quickly, students arranging themselves in what had become an unconscious ideological seating chart. Marcus took his usual seat near the front, despite knowing it would make him more visible during the inevitable heated discussions. "Today," Dr. Whitfield began, her voice carrying the confidence of decades in academia, "we'll be discussing the intersection of populism and democratic institutions." Her eyes swept across the room, lingering momentarily on Marcus. "And I'll be announcing your final paper assignments, an opportunity to demonstrate your understanding of contemporary political movements and their implications for American democracy." Marcus felt his pulse quicken slightly. He had already begun formulating ideas for his paper, knowing it would need to be exceptional. Not just because he was a black conservative, a combination that often drew scrutiny from both sides of the political spectrum, but because he genuinely believed in the importance of diverse political discourse. As Dr. Whitfield continued her lecture, Marcus took detailed notes, his mind already racing with possibilities for his paper. He was aware of the whispers and glances he sometimes received, the unspoken questions about how a young black man could hold conservative views, especially in today's political climate. "Remember," Dr. Whitfield's voice cut through his thoughts, "your analysis must be grounded in academic rigor and supported by credible sources." Another glance in Marcus's direction. Personal political biases have no place in scholarly work. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on Marcus. He'd seen how academic rigor could be used as a shield for ideological bias, especially against perspectives that challenged the dominant narrative in academia. After class, as students filed out, Marcus lingered, reviewing the paper requirements one more time. His fingers traced over the words "contemporary political movements" on the assignment sheet, his mind already forming an outline for what would become a controversial choice: an academic defense of certain MAGA policies based on economic and foreign policy impacts. Little did he know, this paper would not only challenge the political orthodoxy of Liberty State University, but would also unleash a chain of events that would force the institution to confront its own biases about race, politics, and academic freedom. Walking out of the building, Marcus pulled out his phone to call his father, Dr. James Johnson, though few knew of their relationship. As dean of the political science department, his father had always taught him the importance of standing up for his beliefs while maintaining academic excellence. But for now, that connection remained their carefully guarded secret. "Dad," Marcus spoke quietly into his phone, finding a private spot under an old oak tree. "I think I know what I'm going to write about for my final paper. And it might cause some waves." The sun was setting over Liberty State's campus, casting long shadows across the quad, as Marcus began to contemplate the storm that was about to unfold. The library's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow as Marcus hunched over his laptop, surrounded by stacks of economic data reports and policy analysis papers. It was past midnight, but he wasn't alone. A few other graduate students were scattered throughout the quiet space, all working on Dr. Whitfield's final paper. An academic analysis of MAGA economic policies. Impact on manufacturing jobs and international trade relations, Marcus muttered, reading his working title aloud. He knew the choice was bold, perhaps even dangerous in the current academic climate, but the data he'd found was compelling. His phone buzzed softly. "Jennifer, you still alive in there?" Grinning face with sweat. "Marcus, barely. This paper is either going to be brilliant or get me expelled." "Jennifer, just saw your topic on the submission portal. You're really going there, huh?" "Marcus, someone has to. With actual data, not just rhetoric." "Jennifer, be careful. You know how Dr. Whitfield gets about certain viewpoints." "Marcus, truth shouldn't have a political party, Jen." Marcus leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. The past week had been a blur of research, writing, and second-guessing. He'd found surprising statistics. Manufacturing job growth in specific regions, unexpected trade balance improvements, and economic indicators that contradicted the mainstream narrative. During class discussions, the tension was becoming palpable. Dr. Whitfield had been previewing students' topics, her reactions telling. When Marcus had briefly mentioned examining MAGA policies, the temperature in the room had dropped noticeably. "Mr. Johnson," she had said, her voice carrying that particular tone of academic condescension, "I trust you'll be approaching this from a critical perspective?" "I'll be approaching it from a data-driven perspective, Professor," Marcus had responded, maintaining eye contact. "The numbers tell their own story." The whispers had started immediately. Marcus caught fragments. "Of course the token conservative. Can't believe he's defending. Must be confused about." Now, 2 days before the deadline, Marcus was putting the finishing touches on his work. His research was meticulous, his sources impeccable, his analysis thorough. He'd even had 2 economics professors review his data methodology, though he'd been careful not to reveal his conclusions to them. A memory surfaced of his father's words. "Excellence is the best defense against bias, son. Make your work so solid they can't dismiss it without exposing their own prejudice." The next morning, during class, Dr. Whitfield was discussing political movements and their impact on academic discourse. "Certain ideologies," she announced, pacing the front of the room, "masquerade as legitimate political discourse while actually undermining democratic institutions." Her gaze swept the room, lingering meaningfully on Marcus. "As scholars, we have a responsibility to expose these dangerous narratives." Marcus felt his jaw tighten but kept typing notes. Around him, several students nodded enthusiastically. Jennifer, sitting nearby, shot him a concerned glance. After class, in the hallway, he overheard 2 students talking. "Did you see the submission titles?" one whispered. "Johnson's actually writing a pro-MAGA paper." "Seriously? And he's, you know." The other student glanced around uncomfortably. "Black. Yeah, makes no sense. Talk about internalized." Marcus walked past them, head high, grip tightening on his laptop bag. Inside was the nearly finished paper. 25 pages of economic analysis, policy evaluation, and data-driven conclusions that challenged the dominant narrative. That evening, in his apartment, Marcus made the final edits. His phone buzzed again, his father. "How's the paper coming, son?" "Almost done, Dad. But I'm worried about the fallout. Remember what I taught you. Let your work speak for itself. If they can't separate their politics from their academic judgment, that's on them." Marcus nodded, though his father couldn't see it. "I know. But what if dash? No what ifs. You did the research. You have the data. Stand your ground." After hanging up, Marcus opened his laptop one last time. The paper's conclusions stared back at him. While controversial, the empirical evidence suggests that certain economic policies implemented during the MAGA movement had measurable positive impacts in specific sectors and regions. This analysis challenges the prevailing academic discourse and calls for a more nuanced examination of political policies beyond partisan frameworks. With a deep breath, he clicked submit. The timestamp read 11:42 p.m. In less than 24 hours, this paper would set off a chain of events that would shake Liberty State University to its core, forcing a confrontation with issues of academic freedom, racial identity, and political bias that no one was truly prepared for. As Marcus shut his laptop, He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just lit a fuse. He just didn't know yet how big the explosion would be. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Marcus refreshed his student portal for the 100th time. 2 weeks had passed since submission, and today was when grades would be posted. His finger hovered over the refresh button, heart pounding. Then it appeared. Political Theory 501 Final Paper Grade, F. Marcus stared at the screen, momentarily unable to breathe. Below the grade was a comment from Dr. Whitfield. This paper represents a dangerous legitimization of harmful political ideologies. While technically well-researched, the conclusions drawn are fundamentally flawed and demonstrate a concerning lack of critical thinking. Such propaganda has no place in serious academic discourse. The words blurred as Marcus read them again and again. His phone buzzed Jennifer. "Marcus, did you see?" "Yeah, this is insane. Your data analysis was solid." "I know. You need to fight this." "I will." Marcus straightened his tie, dark blue, professional, non-threatening, and walked toward Dr. Whitfield's office. The hallway seemed longer than usual, each step echoing with the weight of what was to come. "Come in," Dr. Whitfield's voice carried through the door after his knock. Her office was exactly what you'd expect. Walls lined with books on progressive theory, framed articles about social justice, and a prominently displayed photo of her with several prominent liberal politicians. She didn't look up immediately when Marcus entered. "Dr. Whitfield, I'd like to discuss my grade." She finally raised her eyes from her computer screen. "Mr. Johnson, I assumed you'd come. Please sit." Marcus took the offered seat, placing his paper on her desk. "I've reviewed your comments, and I respectfully disagree with your assessment." "Mr. Johnson," she began, her tone dripping with condescension, "as a young black scholar, I would expect you to be more aware of the implications of supporting such policies." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice steady. "Dr. Whitfield, my race has nothing to do with the economic data I presented. The statistics about job growth in minority communities alone dash. Statistics can be manipulated," she cut him off. "And frankly, I'm concerned about the message your paper sends. Supporting these policies, it's not just academically unsound, it's socially irresponsible." With all due respect, Marcus leaned forward slightly. The assignment was to analyze political movements using empirical data. That's exactly what I did. My conclusions are supported by multiple credible sources dash. Sources that promote a dangerous agenda. Dr. Whitfield interrupted again. "Mr. Johnson, let me be clear. I will not validate these views by giving them academic legitimacy. The grade stands." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but maintained his composure. "So you're admitting that you're grading my political viewpoint, not my academic work?" Dr. Whitfield's eyes narrowed. "I'm grading your ability to think critically about political movements. You've failed to recognize the harmful implications of your analysis." "I thought the purpose of academic research was to follow the data, regardless of where it leads," Marcus replied, his voice steady but firm. "The purpose of academic research is to advance understanding, not to provide intellectual cover for regressive ideologies." Dr. Whitfield stood up, signaling the end of the discussion. Especially not from someone who should know better. The racial undertone was impossible to miss. Marcus rose slowly, gathering his paper. "Dr. Whitfield, this isn't over. I can't accept a failing grade for work that meets all academic standards simply because you disagree with its conclusions." "Mr. Johnson," her voice was ice-cold now, "in my classroom, I determine what meets academic standards. I suggest you learn from this experience and consider more carefully how you position yourself in these discussions, especially given your unique position in the department." Marcus walked out of her office, his mind racing. The conversation had gone exactly as he'd feared. Not just academic bias, but the particularly insidious intersection of racial and political prejudice. In the hallway, he pulled out his phone, his hands slightly shaking as he dialed. "Dad? Yeah, it happened. Exactly like we thought it might." He paused, listening. "No," she made it explicitly clear. "It's about the politics, not the work." Another pause. And she brought race into it. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "Come to my office," his father finally said. "It's time we addressed this properly." As Marcus walked toward the dean's office, students parted around him, some whispering, others openly staring. Word was already spreading. The quiet black conservative student was about to make waves, and no one, especially not Dr. Whitfield, was ready for what was coming next. The dean's office was quiet, its mahogany furnishings and leather chairs a stark contrast to the tension filling the room. Dr. James Johnson sat behind his large desk, reading through his son's paper for the third time, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is exemplary work, Marcus," he finally said, looking up at his son. "Your analysis of the manufacturing sector recovery alone would merit publication in a policy journal." Marcus shifted in his chair. "That's what makes this worse, Dad. She didn't even engage with the data. It was pure ideological rejection." Dr. Johnson removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "And she explicitly mentioned your race? Said I should know better given my unique position in the department." Marcus's voice was tight with controlled anger. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Emily Chun, head of the Academic Integrity Committee, entered with a concerned expression. "James, we need to discuss." "Oh," she stopped, seeing Marcus. "I didn't realize." "It's time, Emily," Dr. Johnson stood. "My son has been subjected to clear discrimination by Dr. Whitfield, both racial and political." Dr. Chen's eyes widened as she looked between father and son. "Your son? Marcus Johnson is your—" "Yes," Marcus spoke up. "We've kept it quiet to avoid any perception of favoritism. But now, Dr. Johnson's voice carried the weight of his position. "We need to address this officially. Dr. Whitfield needs to learn that academic freedom goes both ways." The news spread through Liberty State like wildfire. "Wait, Marcus Johnson is Dean Johnson's son? Did you hear? Dr. Whitfield failed the dean's son for writing a conservative paper. But they're both, how can they support?" The headlines on the campus newspaper's website grew increasingly dramatic. "Political bias scandal rocks Liberty State. Dean's son alleges racial and political discrimination. Dr. Whitfield under investigation for grading bias." Dr. Whitfield's reaction was swift and defensive. She called an emergency meeting of her faculty allies in the department lounge. "This is a clear attempt to silence progressive voices," she declared to the gathered professors. "They're using this so-called bias claim to protect conservative propaganda. The fact that both student and dean are black doesn't change the harmful nature of these views." But not everyone was convinced. Professor Martinez, a veteran political scientist, spoke up. "Sarah, I've reviewed the paper. The methodology is sound, the research comprehensive. We can't fail students for reaching conclusions we personally disagree with." "You don't understand," Dr. Whitfield's voice rose. "This isn't about academic freedom. This is about preventing the legitimization of dangerous ideologies in academic discourse." Meanwhile, in the Academic Integrity Committee's conference room, Dr. Chin was leading a preliminary review. "We've uncovered a pattern," she explained to Dean Johnson. "Over the past 3 years, students expressing conservative viewpoints in Dr. Whitfield's classes have received significantly lower grades, regardless of the quality of their work." Marcus sat in on these meetings, watching as his personal struggle transformed into something larger. Students began coming forward with their own stories of bias, not just from Dr. Whitfield, but from other professors as well. The campus became a battleground. Liberal student groups organized protests outside the administration building. "Protect progressive education. No platform for harmful views." Conservative students countered with their own demonstrations. "Academic freedom for all. End political discrimination." But it was the Black Student Union's response that caught everyone off guard. After heated internal debates, they issued a statement. "While we may disagree with Marcus Johnson's political views, his right to express them through scholarly work should be protected. The suggestion that Black students must conform to specific political ideologies is itself a form of racism." Dr. Whitfield's position grew increasingly precarious. Her attempts to rally support were met with increasing skepticism as more evidence of her biased grading practices emerged. One evening, as Marcus worked late in the graduate student office, a quiet knock surprised him. It was Professor Martinez. "You've started something important, Mr. Johnson," he said, closing the door. "For years, we've watched political bias creep into our grading, our hiring, our publishing. But nobody dared speak up." "I never wanted to start a movement," Marcus replied. "I just wanted my work judged fairly. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage," Martinez smiled. "By the way, I've recommended your paper for publication in the department's policy journal. Let's see Dr. Whitfield argue with peer review." As Marcus left campus that night, he noticed Dr. Whitfield's office light still on. Through the window, he could see her pacing, gesturing animatedly while on the phone. Tomorrow, the Academic Integrity Committee would announce their preliminary findings, and everyone knew the stakes couldn't be higher. The evening news vans were already setting up outside the administration building. This story had grown beyond Liberty's state, touching on fundamental questions about academic freedom, racial identity, and political diversity in higher education. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Ready for tomorrow?" "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied. "Think this will change anything?" "Son, it already has." The Liberty State University auditorium had never been so packed. Every seat was filled, with students and faculty lining the walls. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking silently. The Academic Integrity Committee's findings were about to be announced. Dr. Whitfield sat in the front row, her usual confident posture notably stiff. Marcus and Dean Johnson sat on the opposite side, their presence drawing constant glances and whispers. Dr. Chen approached the podium, the room falling instantly silent. After an extensive investigation into allegations of grading bias in the political science department, she began, her voice carrying through the speakers, the Academic Integrity Committee has reached several concerning conclusions. She lifted her glasses, reading directly from the report. First, we have found substantial evidence of systematic bias in grading practices, particularly in courses taught by Dr. Sarah Whitfield. The data shows a clear pattern of grade discrimination based on political viewpoints expressed in student work. The room erupted in murmurs. Dr. Chen continued, "In the specific case that initiated this investigation, we found that Marcus Johnson's paper not only met, but exceeded all academic standards. The failing grade assigned appears to be based solely on ideological disagreement rather than academic merit." Dr. Whitfield stood abruptly. "This is absurd. You're allowing conservative propaganda to dash." "Dr. Whitfield," Dr. Chen's voice cut through sharply, "please let me finish." The tension in the room was palpable as Dr. Chen continued. "Furthermore, our investigation uncovered troubling comments suggesting racial prejudice, specifically the expectation that students of certain racial backgrounds should hold specific political views. This kind of discrimination is particularly egregious in an academic setting." The crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. Phones came out, social media exploding in real time with the news. In light of these findings, the committee recommends immediate disciplinary action. Suddenly, Dr. Whitfield strode to the podium, grabbing the microphone. "This is a witch hunt. You're all enabling the spread of dangerous ideologies. Marcus Johnson has betrayed his own people by dash." "Enough!" Dean Johnson's voice thundered through the auditorium as he stood. "Dr. Whitfield, you've just demonstrated exactly the kind of prejudice this investigation has uncovered. The idea that any student must conform to political expectations based on their race is the very definition of racism." The room fell silent. Marcus watched as Dr. Whitfield's face went from angry to shocked, then to something unexpected, uncertainty. "The committee's decision is final," Dr. Chen resumed after order was restored. "Dr. Whitfield will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a formal review for termination." The announcement sent shockwaves through the audience. But what happened next surprised everyone. Dr. Whitfield, her face now ashen, turned to face Marcus. I never saw it," she said, her voice shaking. "I was so convinced I was protecting students from harmful ideas that I became the very thing I claimed to fight against, a suppressor of free thought." The room watched in stunned silence as she continued. "Mr. Johnson, Marcus, I owe you an apology. My treatment of your work was inexcusable. I let my political beliefs blind me to my responsibility as an educator." Marcus stood slowly, aware of every eye in the room on him. "Dr. Whitfield," he replied, his voice clear and measured, "I appreciate your honesty. This was never about winning or losing. It was about the right to think independently, regardless of race or politics." The national media coverage that evening focused on this moment, a Black conservative student and his liberal professor finding common ground in a recognition of shared humanity over political identity. As the auditorium slowly emptied, Jennifer approached Marcus. "You know you've just become a symbol, right? This story is everywhere." Marcus checked his phone, already flooding with notifications. The hashtag Academic Freedom for All was trending. Major news networks were requesting interviews. "I never wanted to be a symbol," he said quietly. "I just wanted to write my paper." His father approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, son, the most important changes come from simply standing your ground with dignity." That evening, as Marcus walked across the now quiet campus, he received an unexpected email from Dr. Whitfield. "Dear Marcus, Your paper will receive the grade it deserves, an A. But more importantly, you've taught me a lesson far more valuable than any I've taught in my career. True academic freedom means protecting all voices, not just the ones we agree with. I hope that your generation will create a better academic environment than the one I helped perpetuate. With sincere respect, Dr. Sarah Whitfield. 6 months later, the cherry blossoms were blooming across Liberty State's campus. Marcus stood at the podium during the graduate school commencement ceremony, delivering the valedictorian speech to a packed auditorium. When I began my journey here, he started, adjusting the microphone, I never imagined I would become part of a national conversation about academic freedom and racial identity. But sometimes the most important battles choose us. Camera flashes punctuated his words. The story had made him a reluctant celebrity in academic circles, with his case now being studied in education policy courses across the country. Today, I'm not here to talk about conservative or liberal views. I'm here to talk about the courage to think independently, regardless of what others expect from you because of your race, background, or any other factor. In the audience, he spotted Dr. Whitfield, who had been invited back as a guest. After her public apology and subsequent articles about confronting academic bias, she had become an unexpected advocate for viewpoint diversity in higher education. The true measure of education isn't in teaching students what to think, Marcus continued, but in teaching them how to think. And sometimes, that means challenging our own deeply held beliefs. The audience, including numerous national media representatives, hung on every word. His story had sparked a broader movement across American universities, with new policies being implemented to protect intellectual diversity. To my fellow graduates, I leave you with this. Never let anyone tell you what you should believe based on who you are. Your thoughts are your own. Your ideas matter. And your voice deserves to be heard. The applause was thunderous. Dean Johnson stood proud, tears in his eyes, as his son received his diploma with highest honors. The ceremony program noted that Marcus had accepted a position at a prestigious think tank, where he would continue his research on economic policy impacts. After the ceremony, during the reception, Dr. Whitfield approached Marcus and his father. I never properly thanked you both, she said, emotion evident in her voice. What happened last semester? It changed me. Changed this institution. Dean Johnson nodded. Change is never easy, Sarah, but it's necessary for growth. The new diversity of thought initiative you're heading, Marcus added, that's going to make a real difference. Indeed, Liberty State had implemented sweeping changes. A new Office of Intellectual Diversity had been established, with Dr. Whitfield, surprisingly, as its first director. Her personal journey from bias to advocate had made her uniquely qualified to lead these efforts. As the reception continued, Marcus found himself surrounded by younger students, particularly minority conservatives who had previously felt silenced. Your story gave us courage, one freshman told him. Now we know we can be true to ourselves without apologizing for it. Jennifer, who had recently accepted a teaching position at the university, joined the group. Remember when you said this paper would either be brilliant or get you expelled? She teased. Turns out it was both brilliant and almost got someone else expelled. Marcus laughed, but his response was thoughtful. Sometimes standing up for what's right comes at a cost. The question is whether you're willing to pay it. Later that evening at a small family dinner, Dean Johnson raised his glass. To my son, who taught this old university a few new tricks. Marcus smiled but shook his head. No, Dad. To education, real education. Where we learn from each other, challenge each other, and grow together. As the night wound down, Marcus checked his phone one last time. His case study was now required reading in several major universities' education programs. His inbox was full of speaking invitations from institutions across the country. But what caught his eye was a message from a high school student. Your story inspired me to apply to Liberty State. Thank you for showing that it's possible to be both black and conservative, to stand up for what you believe in, and to change minds through reason rather than force. Marcus looked up at the campus buildings silhouetted against the sunset. The place looked the same, but everything had changed. And somewhere in those changes was hope for a new kind of academic freedom, one that truly welcomed all voices. Have you ever faced discrimination for your beliefs? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content that challenges the status quo and promotes real conversations about important issues. Latest update. This story has now been adapted into a documentary series about academic freedom and racial identity in American universities.